So I'm really delighted tonight that Richard can join us. And Richard has spent years researching the links between American forces and the west of England during World War II, and uncovered the forgotten history of the US Assault Training Centre, where troops trained for their spearhead role upon the beaches of Normandy. Working as a battlefield guide in Normandy and Europe presented the opportunity to gather stories from veterans at first hand, resulting in Richard writing several books covering the American troops training for D-Day, the day itself and beyond, and fighting their way across Europe. His group, Friends of the Assault Training Centre, research, explore and excavate wartime constructions across Braunton boroughs. Richard, I'll hand over to you.
Yes, thank you. Well, good evening, everybody. It's lovely to see so many people interested in local history. And it's surprising, really, just how vital North Devon was to the Second World War. Lots of people don't know anything about it. But hopefully tonight I will acquaint you with a few facts about North Devon and the American forces. The Assault Training Centre, if we move on, in 1940, Great Britain, we were really on our beam ends. We were not having a great deal of luck with the Second World War. The German army had actually chased us across Belgium and France until we got to Dunkirk, where we actually managed to bring over 300,000 of our British army back home to England. So we were in a bit of a state at that particular time. And then the Germans had the audacity to put out plans to actually invade England. These were pretty strong plans. They actually started to amass barges from Holland into some of the channel ports ready for an attack onto the British coastline. And curiously, North Devon seemed to figure quite well in the German plans. The only thing we were able to actually do in the light of a threatening invasion was the Royal Warwickshire Regiment actually arrived in North Devon, which had some of the most beautiful sands, most beautiful beaches, which were ideal for an amphibious assault. And the Warwickshire Regiment actually plastered landmines all over the beaches of North Devon. The problem was it was done in such haste that they failed to actually make any charts or maps of where those mines actually were, apart from at the time putting some barbed wire up just to keep the civilians away from the beach. But this is a document that was issued in 1940 about North Devon and the possibility of a German invasion. And you can see just how important the beaches were for a seaborne invasion. Everything from Westward Ho right through to Woolacombe, which was a pretty obvious choice, and some of the ports, of course, all of which the Germans had obviously had a look at and decided that this was a possible way of invading the United Kingdom. The Bulldog Spirit carried on, of course, as you see on the cafe here. In the event of invasion, they're going to close for half an hour. That was typical Bulldog Spirit for the Brits. But in reality, of course, this is the only thing that actually stood between a German invasion and this country, the Home Guard. The Home Guard himself, they did look after a tremendous number of the beaches. It was their job to do so. And certainly at Instow, near the cricket field in the wall, the Home Guard obviously got terribly bored one night because one of the guys actually carved his initial in the wall. They're still there today. By 1942, American forces, after Pearl Harbor, the American forces began to arrive in Northern Ireland. Thousands upon thousands of them began to arrive. It started as a trickle and eventually ended up as an absolute waterfall of American personnel coming to this particular country. They took over the counties of Devon and Cornwall. They made it their own home from home. They changed the roads into one-way systems. They numbered every single road junction. They put up tent cities all over the place, and they requisitioned an awful lot of hotels, principally by the seaside, which was rather nice for them. But they were here in their thousands. D-Day, it was quite obvious right from the very beginning of the Second World War that we were going to have to go back into Europe. And it now became a possibility in 1943. And the man in charge overall of this was General Dwight Eisenhower. He was the big boss in charge. He was more of a diplomat than he was a soldier, but nevertheless, they required that particular mix of characteristics. And Eisenhower fitted the bill dramatically. But who was going to look after the actual campaign on the European mainland? Well, that came down to this guy, General Bernard Law Montgomery. He was the hero of North Africa, the hero of El Alamein, where he probably scored the very first land victory against the German army. He had a reputation to maintain. He was probably got the job because he was publicly, the public loved him, which is quite strange. Because he was actually posted to this to do this job, it rather exceeded his ability. The original plan for the invasion of Normandy was the Bay of the Seine had already been selected. The sand had been tested. There had been some covert visits by frogmen, taking samples of the sand, making sketches of the German defenses, and so on. And the original plan, as it started out, was for 3 beaches. There were 2 British and 1 Canadian. That was Gold, Juno, and Sword. Originally, the names of the beaches were going to be Goldfish, Jellyfish, and Swordfish. But Churchill actually personally intervened and said, how could he possibly inform somebody's husband, brother, or son that they died on a beach called Jellyfish? So they were changed simply back to Gold, Juno, and Sword. But once Montgomery got involved, bear in mind his victory, his reputation had to be maintained. And he gained his victory in North Africa by amassing overwhelming numbers of artillery, tanks, infantry, and aircraft. And he had to do the same again. So what he did, he expanded that 3 beach landing, and we had 2 beaches added at Omaha and Utah. These were the beaches discarded by the British as being far too difficult to land any forces on. So he gave it to the Americans. He also insisted upon having his flanks covered by having airdrops made at each of the flanks. So the D-Day plan was vastly expanded by Montgomery. Early 1943, the American High Command suddenly realized that these tens of thousands of American soldiers arriving in England simply weren't trained at all in the job that they were going to be given to assault a heavily defended enemy coastline. They'd had basic training, they'd set foot inside a landing craft, they got their feet wet, but that was as far as it went. So they really needed to be trained for this specific task for D-Day. So they needed an assault training center. They then had to look for a man who could actually do the task, carry out the mission. And having gone rapidly through the personnel files, they came up with this man. He was a Lieutenant Colonel, Paul Thompson. He was a US Army engineer. He was driving a desk at Washington in the Pentagon and itching to get into the fight. And he was delighted when he was told that he was going to England to set up an assault training center. When he arrived in England, he spoke to the general who started out with the idea and found it was just a twinkle in his eye, he said. Nothing had been done. Paul Thompson had to start the whole thing from scratch, the whole thing. So he initially looked at the basic field manual and he looked up the assault, an amphibious assault on a heavily defended beach. And the basic field manual said, these are to be avoided at all costs and should be taken from the rear later. But of course, Paul Thompson didn't have that option. So he had to come up with his own doctrine. And it was probably then he realized that the doctrine he was going to come up with, D-Day's success or failure, would hinge upon what he came up with. He called a month-long conference in London where he amassed people from all arms, the Air Force, the Navy, and the Army, from the British, from the Canadians who had actually got ashore on Operation Dynamo. And he kept them together for a whole month, and they came up with a doctrine and a training program. This is the Ordnance Survey Map that Paul Thompson actually used when he was making his plans for what was to happen for the Assault Training Center. And his mission was to successfully breach the heavily defended enemy coastline in Normandy, and then fight inland far enough to actually establish a beachhead. It's what he called the fight for the first 1,000 yards. If you look at the map and you follow the railway line from Ilfracombe and the north down to Braunton, everything to the left of that railway line was the land that Paul Thompson needed to carry out his mission. But to do so would mean that several villages had to be evacuated. He put this to the British government and said he needed them to be evacuated, and the British government just turned around and said, there's no chance on earth that you're going to get those evacuated. You'll have to change your mission. And he did. So his mission was then shortened down to just attacking the enemy defences on the coastline. This was something that went desperately wrong after D-Day, when troops who American and British that landed on the beaches, once they moved inland, they had no practice, they had no experience whatever of how to actually deal with establishing that beachhead further inland. So the British government there did cost a lot of lives. The Royal Warwickshire Regiment, of course, had planted all these mines on the beaches, and they'd pushed off to their war in North Africa. And having not left any maps or charts behind as to where the mines were, the first thing that Paul Thompson had to do was to get the mines cleared. The British he had approached and said he wanted a good training area with beaches and so on. But what he was told by the British government was, well, all the best training grounds and training beaches have all been taken by the British and the Canadians. There is one, but it's too rough and stormy for training, so you can have that one. And that was Woolacombe, which curiously turned out to be absolutely identical to Omaha Beach. But clearing the mines left behind by the British soldiers during the threat of the German invasion claimed the lives of 3 American engineers, at which point Paul Thompson said, well, I'm not going to have any more of my soldiers killed. We'll just put barbed wire around the minefields and put it out of bounds. And that's exactly what happened. To carry out his mission, he had to teach the soldiers how to make an amphibious landing. And of course, he required the US Navy to be there to supply him with landing craft. And they took over the other side of the estuary at Instow. And the pictures here are certainly have been drawn by an artist who was at Instow to watch the landing craft there. The US Navy officers, well, they had billets in the hotels along the front, and the sailors, 850 of them, they were billeted in a ship that just anchored just off Appledore called the President Warfield. It was a ferry that had been brought over from Virginia, and it had a curious career after the war. It was bought by a Jewish organization renamed the Exodus. And there was a film, feature film made about the Exodus, where it carried Jews out to Israel. But every port it stopped at in the Mediterranean, it was turned away. So that was quite something. The doctrine that Paul, as conference, had the conclusion they came to was that because it was so difficult to get troops across the channel from the south coast to the beaches of Normandy, the numbers of there was a dearth of shipping altogether, and but there were an awful lot of these little things called Higgins boats or LCVPs, and so this did rather influence the doctrine that Paul Thompson came up with. Within each of those little landing craft would be 30 men, a 30-man assault team. And within that assault team, there were going to be different little sections. So every single landing craft had a self-contained team that could deal with a single enemy defense. And riflemen, well, that was to keep the enemy's heads down, but they just loosed off as they came off. Mortars, that was a little bit heavier, they're trying to drop those into the trenches. Bangalore torpedoes, they were for blowing apart the barbed wire. Bazookas, that was interesting. A bazooka is an anti-tank weapon, which fires a rocket from a sort of a tube, scaffold tube. And it was deemed by the Assault Training Center staff that If a bazooka rocket got lucky and actually went in the front, the embrasure of a bunker, then that would be the end of the bunker, and the problem would be solved. So they were worth pursuing, and they did. They persevered with those. Flamethrowers, again, the flamethrower was to aim at the bunker, and the first thing the enemy would do within the bunker would be to shut down all the ports so the flames couldn't reach in. So again, that would allow the demolition team to rush forward with a massive case of explosives and blow the thing apart. The cynical answer, of course, is with these self-contained teams, they could send in dozens and dozens of these little Higgins boats, each with its own self-contained team. And should some of them actually be sunk, destroyed, or blown up, it wouldn't really matter because there were still a fair 100 or so still right behind them. Well, that was a cynical view, but it was nevertheless a realistic one. The training scheme that Paul Thompson's conference had come up with lasted for 3 weeks. Over 14,000 soldiers attended these 3-week courses. As you can see, it was pretty tight. They had Sundays off, and they got the occasional evening off as well. And it was quite interesting in as much as when they weren't getting their feet wet out on the beaches, when they went into town, into places like Braunton and Barnstable, there were a lot of American engineers there, and the American engineers' lapel insignia was a castle. And of course, in the British Army, a castle lapel is for chaplains and padres. And that's why the North Devon girls couldn't understand why there were so many vicars dancing in the evening. To give everybody the opportunity of what combat conditions were going to be like, live ammunition and explosives were used. 2 of the divisions that were going to be used for the initial landings on D-Day had never been in combat before, so this was extremely important for them. That's posed, by the way, that's not an actual casualty. Although using live ammunition and live explosives, there were bound to be casualties, but the powers that be, the high command, recognized that it was worth the sacrifice to get that experience into the other soldiers. Up on the firing range, as you can see in the top picture, a machine gun lost its range and actually killed some guys who were crawling under barbed wire. It's very easy to happen. It happened again on Exercise Tiger in South Devon, where the vibration of the gun firing actually shook the legs deeper and deeper into the sand, so the barrel actually dropped. And then the bottom picture, 3 landing craft that had a tank on each one. They were making a landing at Woolacombe Beach. They got too far north up near the rocks, and they tried to correct their direction, and in doing so, of course, turned sideways to the surf and promptly capsized. Some of the Navy guys were never found again, which is very sad. The survivors of that were actually taken into the Red Barn, which was used as a Red Cross sort of social centre. And the Mort Hoe and Woolacombe Heritage Centre have got the original Red Cross book where every serviceman that went in had to sign it. And they've got that. It's a good source of information. I mentioned earlier that some of the beaches were visited by British frogmen who actually made sketches, took samples of sand whilst dodging the German patrols sentries as they marched up and down. That information was very quickly passed to the Assault Training Centre, who replicated what those British frogmen had seen. And from there, they were able to work out how these could be demolished or dealt with. The big picture you can see there is something the engineers had to come up against. It's a barbed wire concrete bit and a concrete wall. Top right, you've got something called dragon's teeth, which are an anti-tank obstacle. In pillboxes, obviously. And the Saunton Golf Course, of course, was taken over. That was the flamethrower course. Some of you may have seen my film about that, where the whole, I think at the end of the war, they did say, where's the 14th fairway gone? The Americans have simply destroyed it completely. But certainly they would have these scaffolding towers were erected just to teach the guys how to get down a cargo net from a big ship into a landing craft. Tanks were used on the Assault Training Centre on Braunton Burrows and on many of the amphibious landing exercises, but really they were there not really to fire or to learn anything, but to teach the infantry how to cooperate and work with tanks themselves. On Broadsands was the area where every single loading took place, whether it's vehicles or personnel. That's where it would happen. The landing craft would simply come across from Instow, land at Broadsands Beach, they would load up, and then they would go across Bideford Bar to make a landing on Saunton Beach or on Woolacombe Beach. But on Broadsands, there was a bit of a demonstration area that showed people the sort of obstacles they would come up against and how they should be dealt with. As you can see there, everything's concrete. There's a concrete block, is a small single dragon's tooth. There's a wall as well, and there's all evidence of explosive against all of them. Anyway, that's an engineer working out how to actually deal with one of the dragon's teeth. A little further inland, it was important to teach the soldiers how to get off a landing craft quickly. And this is one of two slightly larger landing craft that are still there. And of course, many of you will probably know about the concrete landing craft, 6 of them. They represent LCTs, tank landing craft. All they had to do was just construct the jaws and an accurate replication of the deck area of an LCT. It was then up to the guys to learn how to get on and get off those quickly, because LCTs would have more than one load to deliver to the invasion beaches. So the faster they got off, the quicker they could reverse off the beach and go back for their second load. On by the landing craft, we've put an information board up there, and if you've got one of those fancy phones, you can actually pick up the QR code, which gives you a video of actually what happened at the landing craft. Dragon's Teeth, they were right in the middle of Braunton Burrows, and at some stage a few years ago, somebody deemed you could trip over them. Well, it was pretty obvious you could, and they was deemed then to be a health and safety hazard, so they were destroyed, which is a shame. If you look at the picture on the left, you can see in the background, you can just see the surf line. And that was an observation post. A couple of admirals there watching one of the landing exercises. And on the right is the picture of that observation tower as it is a couple of days ago. And as you can see, it's now at least 100 yards inland. Surprisingly, you would have thought it would have scoured and gone in the opposite direction. During 3 weeks of training, pillboxes were used. Obviously, if you think about it, there are 4 sides and a roof. That's a pillbox made of concrete. And of course, by the time you were attacking that, you're going to make a bit of a mess of it. And the engineers there who were destined to replace all these things, keep things moving, and they found that they simply could not rebuild the pillboxes in time for the next 3-week course to arrive and blow it up. So what they did, they cheated. They put the they'd make 3 sides of a pillbox. And as the trainees would actually destroy or damage the front of the pillbox by firing bazookas at it or firing heavy machine guns at it or using demolition charges, they would simply put an extra piece of concrete on the front. If you look at the side of that picture, you can see the original sides were constructed using corrugated sheeting. And then to replace that, when they put the next face on, it was then upright timber. Then it was horizontal timber. So they were able to keep those things moving all the time. There's something there some of you might have seen as well, is the rocket wall. This is where they were practicing with the bazooka to try and get that rocket actually in through the embrasure of a pillbox. It was to improve people's accuracy. It didn't work, because when we excavated the area, we found all the rockets had veered off to the right-hand side and were buried at the end. But it was a good try. It was a good try. And it's a fearsome weapon if you're on the receiving end. The Matilda Tank, that's another feature out on Braunton Burrows. It has been dismantled, well, exploded, but it originated across the water at Westward Ho, which was the Combined Operations Experimental Station, where all sorts of quirky ideas were tried out with regard to destroying bunkers, most of which involved a tank, most of which simply didn't work at all. And the Combined Operations Station then said to the Americans, "We've got some tanks here, do you want them?" And they shipped them across the river, and then they were used as target practice by the Americans. This one, in fact, has been blown up not only by the Americans initially, but by the British as well. Because 1946, 1947, when the area of Braunton Burrows was actually handed back to the British military, they took great delight in destroying anything to do with wartime. And mostly, of course, that was the American concrete constructions. A little further north, you have Croix Bay. That was really used by ducks, six-wheeled amphibious trucks, just to bring things in. That was to give them a little bit of practice on how to bring goods in from coasters into the land. And Baggy Point itself, that was a separate training area altogether. The start line was to the east, and the objective was right at the very end of Baggy Point itself. And on the way, they had to overcome barbed wire obstructions, trenches, and pillboxes. So it was quite a self-contained area. And at one stage, the American Rangers were at the Assault Training Center. They stayed for a 3-week period. They were the guys that actually climbed Pointe du Hoc in Normandy, scaled the 100-foot cliffs. And they were supposed to be at the start line for their exercise, and they failed to turn up. The umpires and the instructors got a bit twitchy about that. And suddenly there was an enormous explosion at the head of the headland, and it was the Rangers. They hadn't bothered they'd got snuck around the side, climbing the cliffs at the back, and they climbed up, and it destroyed what they were supposed to do right at the very end. They got told off for that, of course. Anyway, that's one of the pillboxes actually on Baggy Point itself. If you walk up there nowadays, you can see the concrete structures. You can also see where the hedges were actually rooted out to make way for the training ground. Moving further north again, Woolacombe Sands. That's where it was identical to Omaha Beach. The rise and fall of the tide, the consistency of the sand, and the topography, because Omaha Beach is a flat sand, miles of it when the tide goes out, surmounted by hills just behind it. It's exactly the same as Omaha. And that's where the amphibious landings took place at the end of the 3-week training course. Everything was done there. They used smoke, explosives, booby traps, everything was thrown into the mix there. At Woolacombe, the Assault Training Center headquarters was the Woolacombe Bay Hotel. And in Woolacombe itself, they had a band that only played at the, that only played when the flag was brought down at the end of every day. But they were staying in, like most of the other officers, in the bed and breakfast and hotels around. Mort Point, that was used experimentally, in as much as the Navy said to the Army, as far as D-Day is concerned, we will be pounding it with battleships and cruisers. We will make such a mess of the German defenses that you will simply walk ashore with no opposition whatsoever. The Air Force said exactly the same thing, that they were going to bomb the hell out of the German defenses and you'll just walk ashore. Well, the Army didn't believe either of them and said, we'll make our own arrangements as well. And what they were going to do was to fire tanks and artillery from landing craft as they approached the invasion beaches. They did actually do that on D-Day. But for a little bit of practice, the landing craft would load up with artillery and actually travel from south to north using Mort Point as the target. And they found, despite the fact these flat-bottom craft were going up and down a rise and fall of anything between 3 and 8 feet, they could still fire the artillery and actually hit a 45% accuracy. If anything went over the top, that's okay, it just headed off towards Wales somewhere. But it did change the shape, the silhouette of Mort Point itself. It was only, the Assault Training Centre was only in existence for 6 months, September till March. 14,000 soldiers went through there under training. Even the Rangers said it was the best training they'd ever had. And having spoken to veterans a few years ago, they said what was taught at the Assault Training Centre really made a powerful difference to D-Day. Paul Thompson said that without the beaches of North Devon, the success of D-Day simply wouldn't have been what it was. In 1946-47, as I said, the British Army retook the area for the military training, but they had to get rid of the mines that they'd left in 1940. And to do that, they used high-pressure water hoses and simply washed out the mines, collected them up, and then exploded them in a big heap. Nowadays, my little group, what we're doing, we're excavating. We have maps and know exactly what we're looking for and where to go. But of course, what we're finding is the British Army enjoyed blowing up the American constructions. And very often what we end up with is just a pile of rubble. But we're finding everything. We found about 85% of everything that was there. Metal detecting is the same as Normandy itself. It's forbidden on Braunton Burrows for the simple reason that there is still an awful lot of live ordnance out there. We have found all sorts of nasty bits and pieces out there, but we have the license to actually carry out excavations. And for our own safety, we always put a guy with an orange jacket out there first to see if he can find any ordnance. And what we do find usually are quite interesting. That was a bunker that we came across, and we came across a body of a teddy. That's the one on the left, the teddy bear. We don't know how long he'd been there, but he was certainly buried. To try and keep the memory of the young American soldiers alive, in 1992 there was the Woolacombe Memorial erected. There was a big ceremony there, and Paul Thompson officially dedicated it. And on the 70th anniversary, we promoted an event on Woolacombe Beach to commemorate the 70th anniversary. Devon D-Day in 2015, we arranged all that. 2016, we had aircraft land on the beach for Devon D-Day. That's quite something as well. 2017, we had a lot of enactors and really engaged with the people. Caused a lot of problems, I'm afraid, with vehicles parking on the road and so on. Oh, yeah. And then D-Day 2018, again, we had aircraft on the beach and tanks and so on. And that's our little group, Friends of the Assault Training Centre. But as I said right at the very beginning, it is surprising just how important North Devon was for the success of D-Day. And certainly the Americans' success on Omaha Beach couldn't have been what it was, as Paul Thompson said. There we go, Nicola.
Thank you, Richard. If you want to unshare your screen, if that's okay.
Sorry, what have I got to do?
So you've got to stop sharing your screen.
Hang on. Stop share.
Yeah, stop share, that's it.
Stop
well
share.
Done.
Ah, that's it. Yep.
Lovely, excellent. I'm just going to change my view so I can see everybody, and then we'll go over to questions. Thank you so much, Richard. That was so fascinating. It's really amazing to think about the role that North Devon played in the lead up to D-Day and how important that that training was, and the fact that the military still use the burrows today for training as well just shows what the landscape means to for the assault training. So I shall go over to questions. So if you like to use the raised hand icon, if you know where that is, so on the more button, which is the one with the 3 little dots, if you press that, you can press the raised hand icon. Or if you don't know how to do that, if you try and physically wave at me, you are over 2 screens, so I might not catch you. or alternatively, please do write your question in the chat.
I can see a question here from Marcus Spencer.
Yes, Mark, do you want to, shall I read that out for you? So did the 1st Infantry Division attend the centre?
Yes, they did. Yes, the first Infantry Division, they'd been into the invasion of North Africa, Operation Torch. They'd been in the invasion of Sicily. And when they were sent to England, they said, why us again? So they had a lot of experience. But yes, the US 1st Division, the Big Red One, they were certainly training at the Assault Training Centre.
Lovely, thank you for that question. And then Martin's asked that he heard that Lord Mountbatten had looked at North Devon for training but rejected it. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Yes, I don't know if it was him, but certainly somebody at the very highest level did look at Woolacombe and said it's far too rough and stormy. No, we can't use that.
Brilliant question, thank you. And there was a comment in the chat earlier that I just wanted to mention. So Lorna is on here and she's from Mort Home Museum.
Oh, yeah.
So she just said that they're putting together some information and that they have the Red Cross book, which is one of their prized possessions. So that's really nice, isn't it? Yeah, brilliant. Yes. Okay, another, is there a map available to walk around the key areas on the boroughs?
Only in a book that's no longer in print. I'm sorry. No, there is nothing at all, I'm afraid. There are no maps to show these things. I was actually waiting until the end of last year, which I was blown to pieces, to actually bring out a sort of a walker's guide to actually take you around there. So it's in the offing, but it won't be for probably another 6 months.
Just to let you know, actually, Richard, I don't know if I mentioned this before, but we've been doing some guided walks around Braunton and the boroughs, themed walks. There is one on the military history of D-Day, and that does pinpoint where some of the items are from the assault training. So that's on, if you go to our website and you can download it, it's called the Komoot app, and you can actually download it to your phone. So it uses GPS, so you can actually see where you're going. Because obviously, if you don't know the boroughs very well, it can be quite hard to find some of the structures that are left behind. Great. So Paul says his dad was an officer in charge of the minefield clearance at Thornton in 1947. He was only 21 and it was the happiest time of his life.
Very
Rose dad.
Satisfying, I should think. Yeah. Oh, well done.
Excellent. Martin's just mentioned as well that the AOMB have a booklet as well, because they did have a heritage project, didn't they? So I think if you look on the North Devon AOMB, they've got some information on their website.
Yes, they have. They did produce a book, a heritage trail of the whole of North Devon. Yes, we have got a supply of those, but I don't think you can get them anymore.
Okay.
Unfortunately. Try Barnstable Museum. They had them printed. They've probably got a secret supply somewhere.
Yes. So as soon as all the museums are open again, we can hopefully get some more information. And if people want to join in with the group, Richard, how do they find out about it?
Well, providing they've got a shovel, they're welcome to come along. Well, we're on Facebook, and we always publicise when we're going for a dig, and of course anybody is more than welcome to come along. You'll end up being bounced around in a 4x4, usually a World War II Jeep or something like that, to get to the destination, and then you're expected to dig all day. So yeah, you're more than welcome to join us. Brilliant.
And I must mention Odie, because Odie was commenting in the chat, because he's from Texas, which is fantastic. So thank you for joining us, Odie. And he just mentioned your book, The Spirit of the Sands. So presumably you can get that. Where's the best place to buy that from? Can you get that online?
You can get it online at something called Tommy's Guides, or down at the shop at Saunton Beach.
Brilliant. So yes, I think we'll have to put some information together about where we can get these bits and pieces.
And the countryside centre as well, Nicola.
Oh yes, we have. Oh, sorry, we've got some at the countryside centre. Thank you, Martin, for that. Brilliant, excellent. Right, and is there a date for the next memorial event? I suppose it's a bit too soon to plan yet.
Well, it's fingers and legs crossed that June the 6th this year, we may actually get an event on the beach, a 2-day event. Finances, of course, have been cut back dramatically, so the format will change somewhat, and I don't think we're going to have aircraft landing, but it's fingers crossed. But as soon as we get the go-ahead, we will certainly publicise it as much as we can.
That'll be fantastic. And just to let you know as well, we have been talking to Richard about doing some tours as well. So we will be organising some tours with Richard from the Countryside Centre. So we'll let you know about that. I'll just ask this one final question then. Does the Royal Marines' presence in North Devon have anything to do with the Assault Training Centre?
No. The land itself, Braunton Burrows itself, is a military training area. It belongs to the MOD or their successors. The Royal Marines happen to go on to use it. Special Forces certainly use the area for training. And I have taken the Royal Marines out there and shown them around historically, some of the things that are there as well. But there's no direct link. It's just the fact that it is a British training area.
Thank you for that, Richard. Well, if there's no further questions, I will draw the evening to an end. Just to let you know, we're taking a couple of weeks break, but we'll be back on the 17th of March with our new talk series, which is called Spring into Nature. And we're very excited to announce that we've got a special guest speaker, and that's Maya Craig Rose, who's also known as Bird Girl. She's a young wildlife presenter and campaigner. So please do look out on our social media, and you can book the tickets via our website as well. So thank you all for coming this evening. It's been great to be joined by so many of you, and thank you all for your contribution as well to the Countryside Centre and the Assault Training Centre as well. That's greatly appreciated. And finally, I'd like to say a big thank you to Richard for an absolutely fascinating talk and evening. So if you'd all like to join me in the virtual hand clap or thumbs up, thank you very much, Richard.
Thank you very much. Thank you.